The JCPOA or Iran nuclear deal negotiations are happening in Vienna. That's between Iran and the P4+1 without the U.S., with the Europeans using shuttle diplomacy with the U.S. What has been the outcome of the talks? That is one of the key questions, isn't it? Well, here are two simple ways of looking at it. First, some progress has been made, but there's still a ways to go. That is something that we keep hearing time and again. Well, the second one is an even harsher one, which we don't hear much of. Almost nothing. That almost sounds like the talks are at an impasse. Well, the issue of sanctions appears to be the major sticking point, which the U.S. is concocting its own version of what sanctions should be lifted and probably when they should be lifted. For example, Iran has demanded that the U.S. remove 1,600 or so sanctions that's been imposed on Iran after Trump pulled out of the accord. Quite a lot, isn't it? Hi, I'm Kaveh Taghwaei. Stay tuned to today's program since it will be jam-packed. We will have two featured studio guests and two guests from abroad to get a deep look at Iran and the chances of a nuclear agreement breakthrough and whether this agreement is actually to the benefit of Iran or not.
Grand Hotel in Vienna, Austria, site of where the Iran nuclear talks are taking place. So far, 5 sessions in 2 weeks. Any breakthroughs?
We are, though, nonetheless, pleased that Iran has continued to agree to engage in discussions, in direct discussions with us and with our partners on how we move forward.
2 working groups are mapping out what needs to be done. One, a list of measures that need to be taken by Iran, and another, a list of sanctions that have to be removed by the U.S. And now a third group is going to work on a matter of what's called sequence.
The most important question is to talk about the sequence, because we have already talked about measures, and we have now focus more on the question of sequence to make sure that the U.S., who has left the JCPOA, should come back first, should lift all its sanctions first, and then Iran would follow after the verification.
The U.S. now has imposed about 1,600 sanctions. Many of them are non-nuclear related, and they even relabeled some of the ones that were nuclear related to seem that they were related to terrorism. So to dismantle this whole thing, the Iranians want the U.S. to withdraw all the sanctions that were imposed after January 2016.
Let's review that sequence one more time. The U.S. would have to come back to the JCPOA first and lift all sanctions. Iran would then follow after verification. Iran's foreign minister also talked about this, as seen here, which is identical to Araghchi's blueprint that was presented.
Time to bring in our first featured guest of the show. We have the pleasure of having Ali Rezvanpour. He's a political analyst and an analyst of the Caucasus Affairs at the Expediency Discernment Council. Mr. Rezvanpour, welcome to this program.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. My first question to you is a referral back to the previous JCPOA. Now, once that deal was enacted, Iran, according to reports, didn't reap the benefits of what it was entitled to under that agreement. Companies were afraid to do business with Iran because of either sanctions that may have been incurred on them, and also on the issue of human rights. They just didn't want to get into making deals with Iran. Was that the case, and will this time around, will those types of problems be alleviated?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thank you very much. I would like to state that, by taking part in JCPOA meeting right now, which is being held in different parts of sessions in Vienna, one of the most important issues, which is the concern of our Iranian people, our supreme leader, is that we should be very cautious about the process, about the space of the negotiations, about the content of the negotiations. We should be careful not just giving the permission to the negotiators, the 4+1 or also 5+1, to drag the negotiations. If they wanted to drag the negotiations, we should once and for all just retrieve from that meeting and then insist on our own demands. As you mentioned about the sanctions, about human rights, about secondary sanctions, preliminary sanctions, the Western side, the 5+1 group are not trustable, all of them, because once the JCPOA was concluded, after a couple of months, they imposed again some sanctions, which we were supposed to just, be relieved from those crippling sanctions. So in this process, Iranian negotiators should be careful about insisting on their own demands by just referring to our Supreme Leader statements that the Western side is not trustable. And after that, just try not to give the permission to the Western side to drag the negotiations. Otherwise, we won't get any benefit from those meetings.
Okay. You have mentioned the leader on a number of times here in your statements. Let's actually take a listen to one of the statements that he has made regarding the nuclear talks. Let's take a listen to that.
Yes.
اینجور نیستش که آمریکا بخواد مذاکره کنه تا اینکه یه حرف حقی رو قبول کنه، نه، میخواد مذاکره کنه تا یه حرف باطلی رو تحمیل کنه.
Our Supreme Leader is very clever regarding political issues. He says that, the American side is trying to impose some suggestions which are disdainful, which are harmful to the Iranian benefits. That's why we do not, just have any confidence in their statements, in their suggestions. By keeping the self-interest, your opposite side is insisting on one principle. What is mine is mine. What is yours is negotiable. This is a principle of international relationships. Those countries who are taking part in different kinds of negotiations with Iranian side are insisting on Iran to just take back different kinds of steps in which Iran has taken by just reneging on its own promises. The US government just triggered Iran to take some steps in violation of JCPOA.
Very well. Thank you very much. We do appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
We're listening to the statements here made by Mr. Rezvanpour, a political analyst and an analyst of Caucasus Affairs at the Expediency Discernment Council. Thank you for your statements.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Okay, so we heard our guest there talk about some of the different aspects of these talks, especially at the end. Stay with us. However, we're going to be right back after a quick break. Hello, welcome back. This is our in-depth section. Back in 2015, when the JCPOA was signed and hailed as a landmark agreement between Iran and the world powers, Iran was supposed to gain the economical benefits of this agreement. Yet many U.S. business restrictions actually remained. And that's on top of the U.S. scaremongering of countries and their businesses which wanted to engage with Iran. Now, the U.S. and other countries agreed to lift the economic embargo in 2012 in an effort to curb Iran's civilian nuclear program. Now, the move meant that companies in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere were free to invest in Iran and trade with Iran, and many were interested in doing so in droves.
Cooperating with Iran's economy is itself an advantage. In this competition, anyone who enters Iran's economy faster will naturally benefit more than the other foreign companies.
This is a true demonstration of the will to try and do and go back to business in Iran.
We are looking forward to come back and to assist in any way we can the Iranians in the oil and gas, as well as many other industries.
If the conditions are required, that we can see a flow of investments in various sectors.
But while the U.S. government agreed to lift the nuclear sanctions against Iran, it imposed other sanctions, like over Iran's alleged human rights violations or alleged support for terrorism. These sanctions barred American citizens and companies from most forms of investment or trade with the country. In theory, those sanctions should affect only U.S. companies, but in reality, the law's reach goes well beyond U.S. borders. For example, U.S. financial sanctions still caused problems and made European businesses and banks subject to U.S. economic punishment. This is how much trade should have happened between the EU and Iran.
First, on the economic sector, we have agreed to announce our economic cooperation. We will support the Iranians' bid to join the WTO. We have agreed to exchange business delegations and to cooperate on financial issues. on tourism, textiles, agriculture, and we used to be Iranian main trade partner, and we are determined to take up that position again.
You see how much it covered there? I mean, that's back in 2015 when the JCPOA actually happened. Well, the U.S. wasn't going to have any of that. Former Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin actually threatened EU countries from doing business with Iran.
Let me first comment on Instex. I don't believe there's been any Instex transactions. As we've made clear, we are working on a Swiss channel that we have approved for humanitarian transactions. We'll continue to allow humanitarian transactions. We've warned Instex and others that they will most likely be subject to secondary sanctions depending on how they use that.
Yeah, secondary sanctions. I'm sure that's going to probably pass over. Now, do you want to get an idea about the types of contracts that didn't happen as a result of U.S. scaremongering, like you just heard there, and threats? Let's take a look at some of them. Germany Siemens, $1.6 billion. You got that technology firm to have signed that. Boeing airplanes, remember? $3 billion that Iran signed for all those airplanes. I think there were 100 of them. South Korea Oil and Gas, $1.8 billion. Total Petroleum from France, $4.8 billion. I could talk about 20 or 30 contracts. Well over $100 billion could have been done in sales, potential revenues, but they were lost in that year when these were signed. And after the JCPOA was signed, these, again, to have been actual agreements, MOUs, and also sales to have happened. Well, the U.S. threats, like former U.S. Treasury Secretary, was basic scaremongering. If you were a businessman, how would you react to it? Well, here's one reaction that speaks volumes.
We must be confident in the future while we know that sanctions are still there and the relief is very limited.
Notice the skepticism there. Now, this is back when the JCPOA was signed. So how would a country invest in Iran when that type of pressure was being exerted? Well, let's bring in a guest to make sense out of some of this. Scott Ritter. He was a former weapons inspector in Iraq, where he ran intelligence operations for the United Nations from 1991 to 1998 as a weapons inspector. The U.S. Treasury Department is what we're going to ask from him about how they exerted themselves. Scott Ritter, welcome. You had the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Financial Assets Control, which made it clear that no payments linked to Iran is going to actually get processed through the U.S. financial system. This is when the JCPOA was signed. So if you receive money from Iran, for example, as a bank or company, you must make sure that this money does not then go to the U.S. or to a U.S. bank or to any U.S. subsidiary. But most international companies actually go through the U.S. So how can the JCPOA even be a deal?
The U.S. has always used the SWIFT code, the banking system, as a mechanism of controlling global economics to put pressure on countries to do the bidding of the United States through the threat of secondary sanctions. That is, if a country, for instance, if the United States sanctions Iran and says you can't do business with Iran, any European country or Asian country that does business with Iran and uses the SWIFT system will be subject to secondary sanctions. This has always been one of the powerful tools that the United States Department of Treasury had, and it's clear that the Biden administration, as much as they say they want to rejoin the JCPOA, don't really mean it, because if they meant it, the Department of Treasury, which works for the President of the United States, by the way, could be told not to enforce these. Could be new instructions could be written.
Okay, you heard it there from Scott Ritter there explaining that to us, and we appreciate that from Scott. And finally, all of this brings us to the current Vienna talks, a repeat scenario in the sense that the U.S. is not lifting all the sanctions, while it is also after dividing the sanctions and in some cases relabeling them. Well, this is what the lead negotiator of the talks from the Iranian side has said about sanctions, in which he said we have to go back to the same model of the JCPOA.
No, we have to go back to the same model in the JCPOA. There are sanctions which should be terminated, and the U.S. president has the authority to terminate them, so that they should be obviously terminated through executive orders. And there are sanctions which are actually the result of the Congress, legislation. For them, the president could only waive, and this has been mentioned in the JCPOA. So we want all those sanctions be reversed. Whatever imposed during this Trump administration, whatever imposed or reimposed or relabeled during Trump administration, and whatever is mentioned in the JCPOA should be lifted, and they should reverse whatever has been done, and I think the Americans know best how to do that.
A land full of business opportunities, an investor's paradise. From the population, which is market-oriented, to natural resources, and to its transport capabilities. Here are a couple of snapshots of Iran's untapped potentials, from sea boundaries to roads, railway networks, and commercial ports. Then comes the natural resources. Agricultural products and crude oil ranking 4th in the world, to natural gas reserves coming in at number 2. But the U.S. sanctions regime has bit into Iran's revenues and investors who can profit from it. Iran's GDP growth to have dipped in the negative territory, as seen here for the years 2018, 19, and 2020. Iran's auto sector, for example, has been hit hard. Production to have fallen from around 2 million units to half, around 1 million units.
In 2014, the fear that the United States instilled within the global community regarding the potential backlash financially for doing business in Iran prohibited many European businesses from engaging with Iran after the signing of the JCPOA. And so this is why it's absolutely critical that all sanctions are lifted, not that they are categorized, and certainly that those that were reimposed and or were relabeled are lifted.
Okay, in this segment I would like to welcome Masoud Barati. He is the administrator of the Iranian think tank network, and he has a lot that he wants to say about the talks in Vienna and the JCPOA deal, especially the whole notion of sanctions. Okay, welcome to this program. Thank you for taking the time to come here. My first question to you, give us your feedback on what you think about the talks so far.
My greeting to you also. I'm glad to be here. The talks in Vienna are being conducted within the confines of the U.S. returning back to the agreement. But U.S.'s return to the deal, from Iran's point of view, is for the U.S. to eliminate all the sanctions. In my opinion, there was no need for talks if the issue at hand was solely for the U.S. to return to the deal.
Let's take a quick time out, listen to Mr. Arakchi, his explanation of what sanctions are all about, and then we'll come back to you to get your reaction on that. Let's take a listen to what he said.
Next week, the most important question is to talk about the sequence, because we have already talked about measures, and we have now focused more on the question of sequence to make sure that the U.S., who has left the JCPOA, should come back first, should lift all its sanctions first, and then Iran would follow after the verification.
Okay, what do you think about what he has said?
The point that Mr. Arakchi is making at the beginning contradicts his ending statement and does not match what he said at the end. When we talk about a step-by-step approach, this opposes the official line and stance by the Islamic Republic. When it comes to the nuclear talks, it may appear that the U.S. on the surface may be moving towards sanctions relief. But we had the experience from the previous agreement, when there was an agreement with the P5+1. Although the agreement was the first with the U.S. did all that it could to keep the sanctions and even expand them. It penalized major banks like French bank that it fined $9 billion after the agreement. And then the US and Saudi Arabia established the Terrorist Financing Targeting Center, TFTC, in Saudi Arabia. This was the US Treasury Department's branch for the West Asia region in the beginning of the 2017. This was done when former US President Trump visited Saudi Arabia at that moment. Iran incurred a heavy blow at the end of the year from this organization. This is just one of many examples of how the US not only keeps its sanction structure, but also expands it based on how it sees fit. Even now, during current US President Joe Biden's term, prior to him coming into office, a 50-strong task force specializing in sanctions was set up, consisting of Mr. Cohen and Mr. Nephew and other officials from both parties. This was set up at the U.S. National Security Agency with the aim of developing and expanding sanctions. If we are seeing that the sanctions pressure is not as intense as before, it's not because they are negotiating with us, but it's because of the sanction cycle. Definitely after 1 or 2 years, there will be new sanctions that will be applied or will come about.
Okay, thank you very much. That's some insightful stuff there. We do appreciate your comments. Masoud Barati, Iranian think tank network. He is the administrator of that think tank. Thank you so much for joining us here in Economic Divide. Okay, lots of good stuff there from our guest, which I'm sure you'll be thinking about. At this point, we are going to take a quick break here on Economic Divide, but do stay with us. We'll be right back.
The toughest and most comprehensive multilateral sanctions that the Iranian government has ever faced.
17 specific sanctions against Iran's largest steel.
It's all about the sanctions with the U.S. when it comes to Iran. The U.S. has sanctioned all that it could, from Iranian officials to industries and even Iran's leader.
An executive order imposing hard-hitting sanctions on the Supreme Leader of Iran and the Office of the Supreme Leader of Iran and many others.
How is that for diplomacy? The U.S. calls it the maximum pressure campaign.
That they will face mounting financial isolation.
But even according to their own officials, it has failed.
It's been many years since the United States has had that kind of...
Take Rob Malley, U.S.'s Iran envoy. He has said that the maximum pressure on Iran has failed, and that a return to the nuclear deal is the first step out of the morass. His suggestion? To offer Tehran a Goldilocks-style deal. Enough sanctions relief so that Iran will return to the deal, but not so much that it would leave the U.S. President Joe Biden vulnerable to hardliners at home. The U.S. side has said that they have a list of measures on both sides to come back into compliance. The next step is to sequence these to allow both sides to save face.
Iran has been slowly moving away from its JCPOA commitments and coping with the sanctions. In the past months, with Biden having made no progress in lifting the sanctions, Iran has reached 1 million barrels of oil per day in its oil export, and the capital that was blocked in Iraq, South Korea, and Japan, well, it has become more accessible to it. I mean, Iran is getting past that crisis, it's getting past the COVID-19 pandemic by signing contracts for export of its domestically made coronavirus. I'm saying all this to point to the direction that whether or not a deal takes place, and in this program we've tried to toe the line in the middle by bringing the guests and the viewpoints that we have, that deal or not, Iran is going to move forward. It will progress. So it's time for the West, in particular the U.S., to make its mind up whether it wants to make a deal with Iran or not. That does it for this edition of Economic Divide. Do send us your comments and questions. We always welcome them. From Mikavet Tafwai and the whole team, it's goodbye until next time.